January 23, 1942. Liverpool, England. The cold wind cut through the thick fog hanging over the Mersey River, but the men on the docks didn't flinch. They had been here countless times before, unloading the usual cargo of ammunition, food, and equipment. Today, though, something was different. A low hum filled the air, the sound of something old yet new. It was not the rumble of a warship, but the quiet, almost innocent sound of a civilian merchant vessel gliding into port. She was unremarkable at first glance. Nothing about the ship screamed power or sophistication. A rusted hull, peeling paint, and worn sails. A ship that, in many ways, had outlived its usefulness in a world plunged into war. Yet, it wasn't the ship that mattered. It was what lay within her and the men she carried with her. This vessel, christened the Joffre, had been transformed into something more than a simple cargo ship. Beneath her civilian exterior, she now housed a powerful weapon, a weapon that no one would have imagined possible. The British Navy had taken an outdated design, one that many considered nothing more than an expendable part of the old world, and refashioned it into the very symbol of innovation in warfare. But there were few who truly believed it would work, and fewer still who understood what this would mean. The Joffre was part of a top-secret project, one that had begun as a mere hypothesis, an experiment to turn everyday merchant ships into an unassuming threat to the Nazis. The idea, laughed at by military brass at first, had been simple. What if they could take these unarmored ships, already familiar to the seas, and add something so deadly that the enemy would never see it coming? This ship was no giant battleship, no imposing war machine with layers of armor. She wasn't even a destroyer or a frigate. The Joffre was a simple freighter that had been painstakingly reconfigured to carry an assortment of cutting-edge weaponry, radar, sonar, anti-aircraft guns, and most importantly, advanced torpedoes that could be launched from unexpected angles. In other words, the ship was about to become the perfect Trojan horse. It was all part of a plan to outsmart an enemy who had become far too reliant on brute force and predictable patterns. But there was a problem. No one believed it could work. The higher-ups in the Royal Navy scoffed at the notion. They believed naval warfare was about muscle, large, heavily armored ships, with towering turrets and imposing hulls. They scoffed at the idea of using something so harmless, a civilian vessel. How could something so ordinary, so vulnerable, be the key to taking on the might of the German U-boats that had been devastating supply lines? How could it possibly stand up to the sheer weight of the German Navy? On the ground, the men tasked with bringing this project to life were given no assurances. They were told only what was necessary and nothing more. In fact, most of them weren't even given proper training. Many of them were former merchant sailors, men who had spent their days ferrying goods from port to port, far removed from the brutal realities of war. They were given little more than a crash course in warfare tactics and thrust into the unknown. But those men were about to prove something that the Navy's brass could never have predicted. It wasn't about the ship, it was about the people aboard it. The first mission was almost a joke to the commanders. There was no excitement, no fanfare, just another ship being pushed out to sea to carry out its mission. They were told to go from Liverpool to the North Atlantic, to navigate the deadly waters and perform what seemed like a minor task: escort a convoy across hostile seas. They were given no promise of protection, no assurances of survival, just orders to do their best and hope for the best. But out on the waves, there were no promises. As the Joffre slipped past the docks and into the darkening waters, her crew, some seasoned sailors, some green novices, felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them. No one could say for sure what lay ahead. Some of them had heard rumors about the ship's new capabilities. Others dismissed it all as wishful thinking. But all of them knew this would be no ordinary convoy mission. The seas were a war zone now, and every wave was a potential threat. They were no longer just merchants. They were soldiers now, forced to adapt or die. By the time they entered the North Atlantic, the Joffre had become a ship of paradoxes. To the world, she was a harmless freighter. To the enemy, she was an invisible menace, a ship that could do far more damage than any battleship could hope to. Yet within her walls, no one had the certainty they needed. They could not know if the innovations would work, if the torpedoes would fire properly, if the radar would track targets, if the sonar would spot the submarines lurking below. All they had were their instincts and their belief that they were part of something bigger than themselves. The silence of the ocean was broken only by the howling winds and the occasional hum of machinery. But beneath it, something else stirred, a sense of unease. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something else, something more primal. They were in uncharted waters, navigating not only the literal expanse of the ocean, but the unknown future of a new kind of war. And then, after what seemed like hours of nothing but the sound of waves and engines, the first sign of danger appeared. A flicker on the radar, a dark shape slicing through the water. A U-boat. It wasn't supposed to happen this soon. But then again, the mission wasn't supposed to be this dangerous either. No one had anticipated a fight this early on. The Joffrey wasn't supposed to be out here with the enemy so close. But here she was, exposed and vulnerable in the open sea. They had to act quickly. The orders came fast, too fast, maybe, but that's how the military worked. Everyone aboard knew what they had to do. They activated the torpedoes, and for the first time, they saw their ship's potential come to life. The Joffrey had been designed not to fight in a traditional sense, but to outwit, to surprise. And now, for the first time, it was clear the weapon was working. The torpedo fired, the U-boat was hit, and the ship, this old, forgotten vessel, had taken down a deadly enemy. But no one had been watching. No one had believed. The irony wasn't lost on them. It was a simple ship that had just succeeded where the mighty battleships had failed. June 5th, 1943. The North Atlantic at the edge of the known world. The sea stretched out endlessly, a desolate expanse of gray and black that seemed to merge with the sky above. For the men aboard the Joffrey, this was no longer just a mission. It was survival. The cold was biting, the wind relentless, and the waves towered as if the ocean itself was testing them. On deck, the crew huddled together, their breath visible in the crisp air, their faces drawn with fatigue. But it wasn't the sea they feared. It was the enemy that lurked beneath it. The U-boats had been waiting. For months, the men aboard the Joffrey had encountered these silent killers, their periscopes glinting just above the water, their torpedoes striking with terrifying accuracy. No one had expected them to survive long. It was a given that the convoys would lose ships. That was the nature of war. But there was something different about this ship. It wasn't the size, the armor, or the firepower. It was the unspoken bond between the men on board. They were the outsiders, the ones who didn't belong in this war. But somehow, they were the ones who had begun to change the game. The first few weeks had been a blur of uncertainty. Their orders had been simple: escort the convoy. But that had been a world ago, and now, on this unforgiving stretch of the Atlantic, the stakes were higher. The crew had started out as civilians, merchants, dock workers, and fishermen, none of whom had ever imagined they would find themselves in the heart of a war. Yet here they were, far from home, facing down a threat they barely understood. The ship's transformation had been swift. They had been told that the Joffrey was just another test, a prototype of sorts. They were the guinea pigs. They would test the radar, the sonar, the new torpedoes, each device a leap forward in naval warfare. But no one could tell them if it would work, if the Joffrey would live up to its promise. All they had were their instincts and a blind trust in the men who had designed it. And slowly, as the days passed, those instincts began to guide them in ways they hadn't expected. They didn't have the luxury of training for these operations. They didn't have time to sit in classrooms and learn how to be soldiers. Instead, they were thrown into the chaos of war, forced to adapt, improvise, and survive. Their tactics weren't based on textbook strategy. They were based on gut instinct, on knowing how to read the ocean, how to sense danger before it came. It wasn't easy. The Joffrey had no real protection. No armor to shield her from the enemy's deadly fire. No thick steel to absorb the impact of a bomb or a torpedo. Yet somehow, the ship managed to evade the attacks, slipping through the cracks in the enemy's defenses. It wasn't luck. It was ingenuity, and it was desperation. At the beginning, They used the ship's unassuming appearance to their advantage. To the enemy, the Joffre looked like any other freighter, an easy target, an afterthought. But what the Germans didn't know was that the ship had been transformed into something far deadlier. The radar systems were sophisticated, better than anything the enemy had expected. The sonar worked perfectly, picking up the faintest traces of underwater movement, allowing the Joffre to stay one step ahead. And the torpedoes, those deadly projectiles, had the potential to take out even the most formidable U-boats. The first time they fired them, the crew held their breath. The anticipation was unbearable. Then, with a sickening thud, the torpedo launched and tore through the water, striking the U-boat with a precision that stunned everyone on board. The enemy submarine went down in a flurry of bubbles and debris. For a moment, the men on the Joffre stood frozen. The realization of what they had just done hit them hard. They weren't just surviving, they were changing the course of the war. But victory didn't come without cost. The Joffre wasn't invincible, and the crew knew it. After their first kill, they had felt invincible. But that was just the beginning. The enemy would not take this lightly. The U-boats would adapt. They would find a way to counter the Joffre's new tricks. And so, the Joffre pressed on, each mission feeling like a step closer to the edge. On the next mission, they encountered a far more formidable enemy, a U-boat that had already sunk 3 other vessels in the past week. This time, they couldn't rely on their luck. They had to be smarter, faster. They used the Joffre's limited speed to their advantage, cutting a tight circle around the submarine, staying just out of range of its deadly torpedoes. They launched another strike, but this time the enemy retaliated with ruthless precision, forcing the Joffre to maneuver through a rain of gunfire. The ship's crew worked like a well-oiled machine. They fired back, adjusting the torpedoes, recalibrating the radar, calling out orders and adjustments with a calmness that belied the chaos around them. Every man knew his role. They were no longer just a group of strangers thrown together. They were a team, a family forged in the fires of war. But despite their best efforts, the battle seemed to drag on for hours. The Joffre was taking hits. The radar was failing intermittently, and the sonar was picking up multiple targets. There were moments when it seemed the crew wouldn't make it. The ship shuddered as another barrage of enemy fire struck, and for a split second, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Then, just as all hope seemed lost, a miracle happened. The Joffre's radar systems, adapted and recalibrated by the crew, picked up something unexpected, a convoy of enemy ships far off in the distance. The men had no time to waste. With every ounce of energy, they guided the Joffre toward the convoy, the U-boats trailing behind. It was a last-ditch maneuver, one born of desperation and instinct. They had no time to calculate odds or outcomes. They only had time to act. In the end, the Joffre managed to inflict enough damage to cripple the enemy fleet, forcing them to retreat. It wasn't a total victory. It never was in war, but it was enough to prove that they weren't outmatched. They were against all odds winning. October 16th, 1944. The European theater of war. The fog had settled over the sea, a blanket that clung to the waves like a second skin. The Joffre sailed through it, her hull cutting through the water with quiet determination. She had come a long way since her early days of testing, those frantic, uncertain missions through the North Atlantic. Now, she was a legend in her own right, a symbol of ingenuity and survival. But the men aboard her knew that the war was far from over. The battle was not just against the enemy. It was against time, against history, against the forces that tried to erase their accomplishments. The Joffre had proven herself time and time again. She had outwitted the U-boats, defeated superior enemy vessels, and altered the course of naval warfare in ways that no one had anticipated. But despite all of her victories, she remained a shadow of what she could have been. The ship, like the men who sailed on her, had been cast aside by the very institutions that should have celebrated her. They were no longer just soldiers in a war. They were ghosts, forgotten by the very history they had shaped. The convoy had been a routine one at first, another task to carry out in the vast ocean that seemed to stretch on forever. But as the crew went about their duties, there was an unease in the air. They could feel the weight of their past achievements hanging over them, a burden that had not been properly acknowledged. For all their success, for all the lives they had saved, no one had ever truly recognized the Joffrey for what she was. She had become a mere footnote in the story of the war, a tool used by the Navy, but never credited for the victories she had helped win. The Joffrey's crew, once filled with pride, now found themselves questioning the very nature of their place in history. Their mission was simple: deliver supplies, protect the convoy, and avoid the ever-present threat of German U-boats. But each day that passed, the shadow of their forgotten legacy loomed larger. The Joffrey had been a weapon that changed the tide of war, but no one knew her name. Her success had been overshadowed by larger, more glamorous vessels, the warships that would take the credit, that would be remembered in the official reports. The Joffrey, once seen as an afterthought, had become the unsung hero of the Atlantic, and the men aboard her were no different. Their achievements, their sacrifices, would never make it into the history books. In the silence of the night, as the ship continued its course, one of the sailors, an old merchant seaman who had seen more than his share of battles, sat on the deck, staring out into the dark abyss. He thought about his family, about the years he had spent away from home. He thought about the men who had fallen along the way, their names never mentioned, their stories never told. He wondered if they would ever be remembered, or if they, too, would be swallowed by the ocean, like so many others who had fought in this war. It was a thought that haunted him, and yet he knew that for all their efforts, they would never be given the recognition they deserved. The Navy had already begun to downplay the Joffrey's successes, claiming that her contribution was no more than a footnote in the larger narrative of the war. But the truth was different. The truth was that the Joffrey had helped turn the tide of the war in ways that no one had fully understood at the time. The strategy she had pioneered, the use of unassuming ships as deadly weapons, had been copied by other nations and eventually became the standard in modern naval warfare. The Joffrey had been ahead of her time, and yet she had been forgotten. But it wasn't just the Joffrey that had been overlooked. The men who had sailed on her, who had made her success possible, had also been left behind. They had been dismissed, their bravery dismissed as luck or coincidence. The higher-ups had claimed that the Joffrey was just another experiment, nothing more than a temporary solution to a temporary problem. The heroes who had brought her to life, who had risked everything to prove the power of innovation in the face of overwhelming odds, were no longer part of the narrative. And so, as the ship sailed on, the men found themselves grappling with an undeniable truth. They were being erased from history. The victories they had won, the lives they had saved, were slipping through their fingers like sand in the wind. They had fought for something greater than themselves, but no one would ever know their names. But then, as the Joffrey entered the final phase of her mission, a new kind of reckoning began to unfold. The battle was far from over. The Joffrey had delivered one final blow to the enemy, crippling a critical supply line that would set the stage for the Allied invasion. Her actions had been instrumental in bringing about the downfall of the German war machine. But as the men celebrated their success, they were keenly aware that this victory would not be recognized. The war would be won, but the ship and the crew would remain in the shadows.